State of the EU and Global Trade Policy. My guest is David O'Sullivan. He is senior counselor in the law firm of Steptoe Johnson. David, welcome.
My pleasure. Lovely to be here.
And thank you so much for being with me today. So what are some of the major aspects of EU trade and regulatory policy that are currently in play right now? What should we be thinking about and hearing about?
Well, as you probably know, Bob, the European Union is the world's largest trading bloc and is at the center of probably the largest free trade network that the world has ever seen. So trade is really very important for the European Union. And the European Union is continuing to negotiate trade liberalizing deals. For example, there's a rather controversial one with Mercosur, which is almost finalized, but not quite there yet. But at the same time, as everywhere in the world, there are some questions about whether the benefits outweigh some of the disadvantages. One big issue in Europe at the moment is the enforcement of existing trade deals. In other words, making sure that our trading partners are living up to some of the commitments they have taken, for example, in relation to labor standards or environmental standards. Environmental standards, climate change is a big issue in the Mercosur deal, for example. Mm-hmm. And so the European Union is also equipping itself with new means of taking action against trading partners whom we feel are not fully compliant with the kind of standards that we need for a level playing field. So those are the kind of issues. We find that coming across the issue of subsidies, coming across the issue of environmental standards, and of course, in the digital space, the issue of digital regulation, and of course the digital sales tax, which is a big issue in the OECD.
Yeah, a lot of issues there. Just to clarify, in the Mercosur countries, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Okay. Environmentally, there is officially a European Green Deal. Is there? If so, what is the status of that exactly, and how sweeping change would result from that passage of that act?
Well, this is pretty revolutionary. I mean, the European Union is aiming to be carbon neutral by the year 2050, which is a fairly dramatic change, and with an interim target of reducing emissions by 55% by 2030. So this requires a fairly radical overhaul of nearly all aspects of economic activity, and indeed even social activity. So this is currently in discussion, being enacted, piece of legislation after piece of legislation, which is affecting auto emissions, home insulation, public transport, all aspects of economic and social activity. And it's a big gamble. The European Union is gambling that this is the wave of the future, and that getting ahead of the curve on being carbon neutral will give the European Union a competitive advantage over time.
Well, you could clarify for me, if you will, just what kind of muscle the EU has in putting forth deals of this sweeping nature. In the case of the Green Deal, it comes out of Brussels and then must be individually approved by the legislatures of each EU member, or does it automatically become the rule for all of the EU without those individual countries passing on it?
Yeah, it's not decided by each individual country. The legislative process is we have a Council of Ministers which brings together the member states. And we have a directly elected European Parliament. So they are the co-legislators.
I see.
Most of this will be decided by qualified majority vote amongst the member states and a simple majority in the European Parliament. So it does not require unanimous agreement of all member countries.
You mentioned taxation. On the digital side, we have the Digital Services Tax. We have the Digital Services Act as well. Can you explain a little bit about what that's all about?
Well, there are three, I think, major issues on the table in terms of digital. The digital sales tax, which is being addressed also through the OECD in Paris, which is basically the desire of a number of countries to impose taxes on platforms based on their economic activity in individual countries, as opposed to their sort of global economic activity. It is hoped that there will be a solution in Paris through the OECD, and the new US administration has taken some very positive moves in this regard. So the hope is that we can agree a global outcome on this, which will then be implemented at the European level, at the American level, elsewhere, but it will not be disparate across different regions, which would otherwise be the outcome. Then you have the Digital Services Act, which is basically about the regulation of platforms, and in particular as regards issues like hate speech, fake news, and so forth, and the control which is put in place to limit the ability of certain groups or certain political activists to manipulate the platforms for things which would be illegal in the real world, and which the Europeans believe should therefore not be legal in the digital world. And finally, you have the Digital Markets Act, which is about basically antitrust issues related to large tech companies and the extent to which you need maybe slightly different rules of the road for those companies than for traditional companies operating in the what I might call the bricks and mortar economy.
Yeah, it seems that in all of those areas, Europe has been ahead of the United States in terms of coming up with policy that might restrict some of the excesses of the digital media. In the post-Brexit area, how do you see EU coping? Did it sustain any kind of blows to its stability or viability as a result of Britain's withdrawal, or is it just continuing on minus Britain?
Well, I think most people would say that the departure of the UK from the EU was a sad moment. Someone leaving the family, if you like. Mm-hmm. Economically, yes, it is a loss. The UK is a significant European economy. But I think once it became clear that this was their choice, the rest of Europe decided they would move on at 27, and that's what's happened. The event is now behind us. We're dealing with the difficulties of managing the new relationship, which are complicated. To be frank, there are many issues. We agreed a withdrawal agreement, and we agreed a trade and cooperation agreement, which at least eliminates tariffs, but we still have many unresolved issues, whether that's financial services, data flows, and other issues, which unfortunately, are still going to have to be negotiated. But basically, we've had a parting of the ways, which is relatively amicable. We wish them well, and the rest of the European Union will continue to work as a bloc.
There were fears early on that the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the EU would lead to a kind of a domino effect where other EU members would consider the same. And I'm sure they came up with some very clever portmanteau words for each of those possibilities. We haven't seen anything since then, though. Are those fears justified or not?
I don't think so, Bob. I mean, the situation in the UK has always been a bit specific. One famous French parliamentarian said, the United Kingdom before Brexit had 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the European Union. The United Kingdom after Brexit has 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the European Union. It was a rather sui generis situation. I think in the vast majority of other countries, people overwhelmingly see the benefits of being part of the European Union. This is not to say that everybody loves everything about the European Union, or that we won't have difficulties and challenges. But I think if you look even at some of the populist, high-profile populist politicians, take Mrs. Le Pen in France, she has long since abandoned her previous platform of leaving the euro or leaving the EU as part of her political platform, because she knows this will not get her votes in France. And the same applies in many other European countries.
I see. What about the World Trade Organization? What is the future of the WTO, in your opinion? Can it be reformed?
Yes, I think it can. And I personally believe, and I think many of us who care about the global trading environment believe, that the WTO is absolutely indispensable. And we have to find a way of putting the pieces back together, starting with the appellate body, but also moving on to reform some of the elements of the WTO, which are not fully in line with the needs of the trading system as we are in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Of course, key to this is getting the US on board. Everyone is delighted that the administration lifted the block on the appointment of a DG. So we have a fantastic new DG, a new deputy DG team around her. But we really need, firstly, to try and find a solution to the difficulties around the appellate body, because without a functioning appellate body, the WTO is a bit toothless. But then we also need to address the new agenda, the issues of China, subsidies, digital flows, and so forth, which are not part of the current rule book of the WTO, and which we need to agree. And so I think we have the ministerial conference coming up in the autumn, and I hope that we can really give a renewed impetus to put the multilateral trading system back on track, because it's been so vital for the prosperity and the success of the global trading system.
Just to touch briefly on the subject of cybersecurity, what is the EU doing in that direction? Because as you know, it's just getting more and more dire here in the United States. We had a situation with a power plant being affected by ransomware. Is the EU moving forward in a really effective way to control cybersecurity?
Yes, I mean, of course, there is a large part of this which is the responsibility of individual countries. You can't just manage it at the level of the EU. But there is a very important piece of new legislation which is on the table, which is the Network Information Security Directive, Part 2, which is a follow-up to a previous one, which basically wants to increase the responsibility on companies to report incidents and to explain breaches so that we can have better information about what is happening in real time, because this is really the key. I think part of the challenge of fighting back against cybersecurity is knowing when there have been breaches, how they've occurred. And sometimes, and I understand this, companies don't always want to admit that there have been breaches. Sure. So you lack the intelligence to put in place the defenses that you need. But this is one of the really crucial issues going forward, both in terms of critical infrastructure, but also in terms of security of banks, financial systems, and so forth.
David O'Sullivan of Steptoe Johnson, thank you for joining me today to touch on some of the high points and the critical issues facing the EU, which, as you indicate, continues to be quite relevant, but certainly some reform is in order. But thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Bob.